Another important aspect of knowing which resources are out on the network and need to be protected is virtual machines and hypervisors. Let's start by talking about the hypervisor, which actually runs or supports virtual machine guests. So a hypervisor isn't a specific type of physical hardware. It's just a regular server that's running an operating system that manages virtual machines. So the OS is actually the hypervisor. Think of products like Microsoft Hyper-V or VMware, ESXi or VMware Workstation, VirtualBox. It goes on and on and on. So the hypervisor is the OS. Now we can have an on-premises hypervisor on our own network, which is a physical server that we run virtual machines on. If you're running that on-premises, the benefit is that you have full configuration control of that hypervisor. But the downside is you're responsible for it. You have to acquire that equipment in the first place, which costs money, and then you have to support that equipment. You have to install the hypervisor OS and configure it. Then you can run virtual machines. In the cloud, you just deploy a virtual machine and it runs on somebody else's hypervisor, and we don't care about that. We just care about the VM running. So you can do this on premises, in the cloud. You can even do both. And what I mean by that is for high availability, you could have an on-premises virtual machine that's mission critical. You can replicate it into the cloud. So if something happens on premises, you still have a replica of that VM. It could even be running in an active state in the cloud. There are two main types of hypervisors. The first is called a Type 1 or bare metal hypervisor. Now the thing about this one is it really is the operating system itself. For that to make sense, we have to describe a Type 2 hypervisor. A Type 2 hypervisor is a hypervisor that can run virtual machine guests, but it runs as an app on top of an existing operating system. So VMware Workstation, for example, on the Windows platform is a Type 2 hypervisor because it's just an app that runs within the existing Windows OS. But if we look at something like VMware ESXi, that is a true Type 1 hypervisor because that operating system is designed to do nothing but manage virtual machine guests. The Windows OS is designed to do a lot more than that. Which do you think is more stable? Probably the one that is specialized and designed really to focus on one thing. Type 1 hypervisors are the preference in an enterprise environment running mission-critical virtual machine workloads. Now, what vulnerabilities exist with virtual machines? Well, really, the same vulnerabilities that would apply to a physical server. It's just running within a virtual machine. So you still have to patch the operating system, patch the apps installed in that OS. You still have to disable unused user accounts, unused services, all the stuff that you would normally do to harden a host. You do that the same way for the virtual machine. There's really no distinction. But what we have to think about is also hardening the underlying hypervisor. But again, if you're already hardening your servers on your network, you're already doing that. Now, something to think about is that there is this concept of VM sprawl. Virtual machines are really cool, especially in the cloud, because it's so incredibly easy and quick to deploy them. I can deploy a Linux virtual machine in the cloud in 10 seconds. If I have it automated in a template, even less, as long as it takes for me to type in one command. But the problem that can result from that is VM sprawl. You end up over time potentially with a lot of virtual machines, because it's so easy to deploy them, that are forgotten about. Now that can be bad, especially if they're left up and running, because what you're doing in that case is you're increasing the attack surface. The more stuff you have running, the more attack vectors are potentially available to attackers. We don't want that. So it's important to have some kind of a mechanism in place to manage virtual machines, especially in a cloud environment, to make sure you don't end up with a bunch of old VMs that someone spun up to test something and forgot about it and left it running with a public IP address exposed to the internet. Bad news. Another problem, and this is rare, but it does happen, is VM escape. Think about that term. What does that mean? I've got a virtual machine running on a hypervisor host. VM escape means that there are some malicious attacks that are possible whereby you attack the virtual machine operating system and you can back out into the actual host operating system, which is unbelievable. It's possible. This has been proven at some various hacking competitions around the world, even up to 7 or 8 years ago, where the proof of concept was that the attacker was able to break into a virtual machine and from that virtual machine spawn a program in the underlying host operating system. What they actually normally do is run something simple like a calculator app or the Paint app, enough to prove that they have control to execute stuff. Now let's take a look at an actual vulnerability, a CVE, Common Vulnerability and Exposure Listing, for just this, for VM Escape. You might remember when we talked about threat intelligence sources, one of those sources was the Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures database, which I have here. Specifically, I've got a CVE from 2008 that is really all about being able to break into VMware and allowing users in that virtual machine, that would be the malicious attacker, to arbitrarily write files on the underlying host operating system, which is really hard to believe, but it's true. So we could read the details about that. And again, this is why this is a very important source of threat intelligence. Because without subscribing to something like this or perusing through it periodically, how would you even know this is possible? Because that might be the version of VMware that you're running right now. You need to address it if that's the case. So we already know that hardening a virtual machine encompasses a lot of the standard stuff. Disable unnecessary components, use complex passwords, ideally multi-factor MFA, limit public internet visibility, and also we can even encrypt the virtual machine. Encrypting a VM means, especially in the cloud, that the administrators of that hypervisor would not potentially have access to the VM. They might not even be able to start it. You would have to know a decryption passphrase in order to be able to do that. So why don't we take a look at how we would enable VM encryption in VMware Workstation running on Windows. Okay, so I have VMware Workstation running on my Windows computer, and I've selected an Ubuntu Linux virtual machine. What I want to do is encrypt it. So to do that, I can click Edit Virtual Machine Settings. Then I can click on the Options tab. I can select Access Control, where it says currently the VM's not encrypted. So I can choose Encrypt. Sure enough, it prompts me for a passphrase. So I'm going to enter and confirm the passphrase to encrypt the VM. And then I'll press the Encrypt button. So depending on how many virtual disks there are and how big they are will determine how long this takes. But what's going to happen at the end of the day is that when we try to manage that virtual machine settings or start it, we first will be prompted to enter that decryption passphrase. Now be careful with this type of thing, because you can imagine that if you forget the decryption passphrase, you might as well say bye-bye to the virtual machine. But at this rate, we know that we have a couple of ways that we can harden virtual machines and the underlying hypervisors that host them.